Francis Foster.
I'm Konstantin Kisin.
And this is a show for you if you want honest conversations with fascinating people.
Our brilliant and rather controversial guest today is the author of What is a Woman, the brilliant documentary that you have heard about by now. Matt Walsh, welcome to TRIGGERnometry.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for making the time. You're a very busy guy. We've got half an hour with you, so I'm not going to mess around. We'll get straight into it. Why did you decide to make the movie?
Well, because gender ideology, which is what the movie is really about, is, I think, a scourge on Western civilization. It's plunging, children especially into lives of confusion and identity crisis and despair. I think everyone kind of notices this when you look around. It seems like everyone's lost their minds, and over the last 5 or 10 years, where questions that were once pretty simple to everybody, and so simple you didn't even think about them, now are confusing, and basic concepts about life are now confusing to people. And so the movie is sort of like, first of all, why is this happening? Mm-hmm. How widespread is this problem actually? And then once we've established that, to get into exposing, where it comes from and everything else.
And when you say how widespread it is, that's one of the interesting points that we're kind of exploring at the moment. Is it seems quite often one side is focusing on the extremist on the other side and presenting that as the entirety of the other side. So how widespread did you find that this issue was? What percentage of the population think that you can just change your sex by cutting bits off yourself or whatever it is?
From what I found, it's very widespread, and that's something that I was a little bit surprised by. Now, I knew that this was a big problem, which is why we made the movie to begin with. I knew it was pervasive, but I thought, even because we talked to so-called experts in the film. We also did a lot of man on the street interviews, and many that didn't make it into the film because it's only an hour and a half, and we talked to, I don't know, dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And what I found just going cities and towns across the country and talking to average people walking down the street is that a lot of these sort of half-baked notions that I hear from the gender studies professors and therapists are also coming out of the mouths of just average people walking down the street in an even more half-baked way. Like for them, it's even more sort of undercooked, that they don't, they've picked up these ideas, they hadn't really thought much about them, but they've picked them up is the point. And what I also found is that the titular question of what is a woman was a stumper, not just to the so-called experts, but also to most average people walking down the street.
How much of that do you think is fear-based? Because like you said, we all know the answer to this question. Suddenly they get, they're on camera, they've got a guy asking them questions. I mean, if they answer the wrong way, this could get them fired, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think, and that's a big question too. Is why, especially the average folks that seem to be confused. Are they actually confused, or are they just afraid to answer it? And I think it's a mixture of the two. I think it's a lot more fear-based, and I know that actually for a lot of them because they told us that. There are many more who didn't appear in the film because they didn't want to be on camera, and they said to us that, well, I can't talk about that. I'll lose my job. I'll lose my friends. And they went through the whole list of consequences. And so I think that that's the other thing people have picked up, is that even if they haven't been explicitly told, it's that if you talk about this, you better be very careful, because if you say the wrong thing, we're going to ruin your life.
I remember in 2016, my cousin went to Sussex University. I don't know if you've heard of it. But it's the wokest university in the UK, infamous. And in a lecture in 2016, or rather a class, when he first got to the university, he was asked to declare his pronouns. This was in 2016. Do you think it started round about that time, or did it go back even further, do you think?
Yeah, that's the thing. When you're tracing the origins of this, you can kind of decide how far back you want to go. I mean, you could go back centuries if you want to. We talked to someone in the film named Carl Trueman, who's a great author, wrote a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and which I would really recommend everybody read.
Upcoming guest on our show.
Oh, great, and watch it, and everyone should watch that show when he comes. And he's a really interesting guy, and he talks about the same question of how did this happen? Why is it that he especially frames it as the statement, "I'm a man trapped in a woman's body." That seems to mean something to modern people. It wouldn't have meant anything to our grandparents. So how is it that this statement means something to us? And he traces this back philosophically hundreds of years, right? And so you could do that. You could kind of decide where you want to start. In the film, we trace it back kind of to these landmark moments. We trace it back to Alfred Kinsey, John Money, mid-20th century, sexologists and psychotherapists. And although they didn't invent all of the concepts, they did come up with, I think, what we know of today as gender ideology. John Money in particular coined some of these phrases, like gender identity, he coined that phrase. So you could go back to there, and these ideas start getting into, especially the institutions like academia, and they're kind of in these high-level places, but then they filter down, slowly at first, I think, into the general population. And 7 or 8 years ago, I think that's when it sort of exploded onto the mainstream. It didn't start there, but that's when the floodgates were open. And you could go to, Bruce Jenner coming out as Caitlyn Jenner, winning Woman of the Year. That, for a lot of people, was the first time they were really confronted with, they may have heard of transgenderism before that, but that was the first time that it was really in their face. And then from there, it was just kind of off to the races, I think.
And you mentioned people having their lives ruined. I hope you don't mind me saying there's quite a lot of security around your building here. Is that necessary? Have you had to have that to be able to make a movie like that?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, it's necessary in general just because of what we all do here. And so that's a lot of the security is not specifically for me. It's just because this is what, this is the world we live in now. And but I could say for me in particular, when the movie came out, yeah, we got death threats, doxed, all the rest of it. Quite a lot of it, a lot of it that I haven't talked about in really specific terms, just even for security reasons. I can't even say some of the things people have said to me. And that was all, that was all expected. It shouldn't be expected, but we know that, and I'm certainly not the first person to experience this, that trans activists are vicious on a level that other kinds of activists rarely reach.
Why do you think that is?
I think there are a lot of reasons for it. It's like some of it goes like in a deep psychological way. I think trans activists can be even more vicious to women who stand up to them.
Agreed.
And I think part of the reason for that, if I'm just to like psychoanalyze them, is I think that there's some envy and jealousy, actually. It's the male trans activists in particular who are the most vicious, in my experience. And I think in the experience of women who stand up to them. But then also there's like this idea that if you disagree with them, that you are interfering with their self-perception. And if you interfere with their self-perception, it's like a form of murder, they see. Because if you take away how they perceive themselves, or if you interfere with that or question it, then you're like destabilizing their perception of themselves.
Do you think they actually think this? Because I've always thought of it as a linguistic trick. It's a way of legitimizing violent behavior or threats of violence by claiming that, you're raising their existence, when actually I think they realize they're still there, right? Or do you think they genuinely believe that by saying you can't change your biological sex, you are erasing them?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think there's a lot of drama and pageantry that goes into, and anytime the outrage brigade gets into action, there's always a lot of people that are pretending to feel things they don't really feel. But for some of them, it's at some level they do actually think that the most important thing about them is how they perceive themselves. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a man who identifies as a woman, then that's who you are. But it's this very fragile thing. And if they hear anyone question it, then they just sort of panic and lash out, sometimes violently, I think.
Matt, how do we separate the people who genuinely have gender dysphoria, which is a horrible mental illness, and they genuinely need support and treatment for dealing with that illness, and this ideology? How do we separate that? Still having compassion for people with gender dysphoria, but also criticizing and challenging the not-so elements of the ideology?
Well, first of all, when you're dealing with the concepts on a general scale, I don't think you have to separate it, because what we're talking about is just the truth. So if someone is saying something that isn't true, our first goal should be to affirm and defend the truth. So the reason why they're wrong about what they're saying is almost immaterial in my mind. The first thing that matters, the first thing we have to establish is the truth. Men are men and women are women, period. So that's our first thing. And if we want to get into the specifics of like why are there so many people that are confused about this for themselves, I think then, especially if you're dealing with someone on a personal level, like one-on-one, to understand where this is coming from is important. But we also have to realize that gender dysphoria, people who are, for reasons that are almost unexplainable, really actually confused about this. That's such a small minority, such a small sliver. And all you have to do is look back, 100 years ago. How many people were confused about their gender? Like how many men were going around who really thought that they were women? I'm sure there were some, like very, very small number. And they were mentally ill. It's a mental illness. And if we were still a sane society, we would treat that with therapy, counseling. It's what you do for mentally ill people. You treat their minds to the best of your ability. This astronomical rise, though, in transgender identification, that's obviously not just mental illness. It's not something people are born with. There's something happening in the culture, clearly. Because, yeah, go ahead.
Because in the film, like the first half an hour was really funny. I was sitting there with the lads and we were laughing. We were going like, oh, this nutball saying these.
I wasn't laughing. I saw all the trouble coming.
Yeah, but I was laughing because I think you exposed these elements of it and it was comically humorous. But then what was terrifying is when we saw the medical professionals, the doctors affirming this. Did you expect that? Because I certainly didn't.
Yeah, I think, well, that's one thing I was a little bit worried about actually with the film before it came out, is that we knew we were going to have this tonal shift, and I don't know, is it too abrupt? Is it kind of weird? And it is abrupt and weird, but at the same time, I think it's also necessary that, like on the surface level, this is absurd, and so we laugh at absurdity, which is an appropriate response, but then you go a little bit under the surface, you see there's some really sinister stuff going on, and that's when you get into the doctors who are encouraging, who are sort of spreading this plague and doing it in a really intentional way. And doctors who I think certainly know better. And, we talked to a pediatrician in the film, Forcier, who prescribes these drugs, chemical castration drugs to children. And what was so revolting about that, aside from just, the obvious, is that when I talked to her, like she had no defense of the practice at all. She was not able to even begin to defend this, and yet she's doing it. And so that makes you think, well, if she can't defend it, then she must know that this is wrong. That's just my, that's my interpretation, is that a lot of these people know what they're doing is wrong, and yet they do it anyway. Why would they do it anyway? Well, one big thing is money. There's a huge financial incentive. We get into that a little bit in the film, but you have to keep in mind there's billions of dollars, not for one individual, but like for these industries, there's billions of dollars at stake. And you think about, you got a 6-year-old kid who says that, 6-year-old boy says he's confused about his gender. And if you were to just say to the 6-year-old boy, oh no, you're a boy, and help him to accept himself for who he is, then that's great. That's the right thing to do, but there's no money in that, right? If on the other hand, you encourage him to go delve even deeper into that confusion, then that boy is worth thousands, if not millions of dollars to big pharma, therapists, doctors down the line. So I think there's a real financial incentive.
And, we've interviewed a ton of people about this, trans people who don't agree with some elements of this ideology, other people, gender-critical feminists, etc. And yet I was still shocked by the second half of the movie. Were you shocked by what you found, particularly with doctors and professors?
I was, yeah, that's the thing. Even when you encounter something that you already knew about intellectually, it's still shocking just to encounter it.
Exactly.
I knew that so-called sex change, or what they call gender affirmation surgeries now, which is a euphemism if I ever heard one, but I knew that was happening, and yet to sit across from someone who does this and hear them explain it, it's still shocking just to encounter it. And I was also shocked. There were some things I learned. Like before getting into the film, making the film, and researching it before we filmed it, I did not realize how young the kids are when they start them on the actual medical transition part of it.
How young are they, Matt?
Well, I mean, as young as 10, 11 years old when they start them on the hormones, and you get into puberty blockers, the surgery especially. A year and a half ago, I didn't realize that they really were mutilating kids. I thought that, this is something that starts at the age of 18. But no, I mean, they chop the breasts off of 13 and 14-year-old girls, even younger sometimes. I didn't realize that. And it's, I think a lot of people don't realize that that's happening. And hopefully now they do.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, I think you made a movie that whatever people think about you or where you're coming at it from is valuable. That's what I believe, genuinely. However, the temporary alliance between gender-critical feminists and right-wing conservatives like you was always going to be temporary, and it now seems to be falling apart. You know, you had a spat on Twitter with J.K. Rowling and others. What do you make of the backlash against the movie and against you from that side of the debate?
Yeah, I think it was an alliance that lasted about 45 seconds, it would seem, which I guess was predictable. To me, I find it unfortunate. It's not what I wanted. I mean, I've said from the very beginning, even before the movie came out, that which is one of the reasons why I've very vocally been supportive of J.K. Rowling and said many times that I really respect the way that she stood up against the mob at great personal cost, and she stands to gain nothing personally from it, and yet she has. And I respected that. I still do. And even if you have $1 billion in the bank, it still takes guts to do it, and so she does it. So that's my view. I have a lot of respect for anyone who stands up against these people and stands for truth. And if you're willing to do that on this subject, which is so important, and I think in so many ways, like this is a civilizational crisis we're dealing with. And so if you're on the right side of this, then I can join forces with you for this fight, and then we can get back to, tearing each other apart after we're done with this. That's how I look at it. And I think when the movie first came out, it seemed to me anyway, among some of these gender critical feminists, there was like this internal fight among them about, well, what do we do? Do we link arms with this guy or what? And maybe for a brief moment in time, it seemed like maybe they would, but then ultimately, I think they just decided that they can't do it. I think that, and this
one of the criticisms they made, Matt, was that you didn't include any of them in the movie.
Well, yeah, and that's honestly, it's just not. It's nonsense. First of all,
they aren't in the movie, right?
Right. A couple of things. Even if it was true that I just decided I'm going to exclude them, well, who cares? Is this about you? Or, I mean, is this about, what do you care about here? Do you care about the issue or do you care about yourselves? Like, it would never, if a feminist, if J.K. Rowling did this documentary, it wouldn't even occur to me to say, well, why wasn't I in it? It just seems like such a petty, arrogant complaint. Who cares? So who said that I should be in it? You made the film. You made it the way you wanted to make it. It's important. You did it well, and that's what matters. So I would champion the film for that reason. So I find the complaint to begin with ridiculous. It's also just not true. We actually did reach out to a number of the so-called gender-critical feminists. Maybe not as many as they wish we had. I don't live in the UK. I'm not plugged in with feminist circles. So there are some of these women that have reached out to me since the movie came out and said, why didn't you contact me? It's like, I didn't know you existed before you just reached out to me. I'm sorry. But we did reach out to a number of them.
Do you mind if I ask who?
I've decided not to, for their own sake, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, because the truth is, for some of these names, and there are some big names, okay, I don't really know why they turned us down. So I think if I name them and then...
Oh, so they turned you down?
Yeah, it just didn't work out. And so, but if I name them, then it sounds like I'm claiming that they refused to because they didn't want to work with me or they were scared. I don't know if that's true. Maybe it just was a scheduling problem. Mm-hmm. All I can say is that for a fact, we did reach out, and the women that we reached out to know who they are.
Okay.
That's it.
And the other criticism that was made was that you don't act, I mean, I've heard some people say this, it's not my opinion, but it's an opinion that some feminists hold, that actually you don't care particularly about women's rights. This isn't where you're coming at it from. You're just someone who's using this issue to advance your evil conservative agenda. What do you make of that?
I guess that's true if my evil conservative agenda is just to preserve truth and reality. Like that's what I care about. I make no bones about the fact that I see some of these issues as, I care about some of these issues because they're a battleground for the overall war for truth. So women's sports, for example. Do I care deeply about women's sports itself? Do I wake up every day saying I'm really concerned about women's sports? No, I don't watch women's sports. I don't care about it, in general. But it has become a battleground for the war for truth. So when I'm being told that a man should be able to compete against women, and be accepted as a woman, I'm saying, no, I don't accept that. That's insane. But what motivates me is not my unabiding love for women's sports in particular. It's just it's my love for truth and justice and fairness. It's also not fair. Like, even if I don't watch women swimming, it's really not fair to these women who are having their opportunity stolen from them.
You've used the word civilizational crisis to describe what we're talking about. Now, there'll be people watching it going, come on, this is still a relatively minor thing. It's not affecting a huge swathe of the population. What does it matter if you put your pronouns in your email, etc.? Why is it a civilizational crisis, Matt?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. And the first, I go back to the issue of truth. Like, truth matters for its own sake. And a civilization that fundamentally denies the most basic truth, the most basic realities of human existence, cannot survive. And I say that because it's never happened before. I mean, I can't think of a civilization that's been able to pull that off. It just said, we're going to swear off. We're going to pretend we live in a different universe and continue on. You can't thrive as a civilization that way. So that's the ground level issue. But then also, I mean, you look at what we're doing to children. Children are being mutilated and sterilized on a mass scale. We talked before about the way that the transgender identification has risen in recent years. And to just say that it's risen, I think, understates the case. We're talking about exponential. I mean, we're talking about, for the youngest generation, the transgender identification of the youngest generation is like 20 times what it was for my parents. That's another reason why it's a civilizational crisis. This exponential growth of this identity crisis, this confusion, and there's no sign that it's going to stop. I mean, you don't have 20 times growth like that, and then in the next generation it just goes away. In fact, we see there's this, for LGBT identification in general, there's been a doubling of LGBT identification, generation over generation, doubling, dating back to like my grandparents' generation. And then trans in particular is astronomical rise there. So I think that what we're seeing is that entire generations of kids being lost to this confusion, which leads ultimately to despair. What they tell us about the trans suicide rate is true, that, you know, the suicide rate is so much higher for people who identify as trans than it is for anyone else. But they're lying when they say that the way to solve the suicide rate is to affirm the trans identification. That's not what the data tells us. The data tells us that no matter how affirmed they are, get the surgeries, get all that, suicide rate is still high. In fact, they're more suicidal after surgery than before. So what that tells us is that this leads to despair, ultimately.
Matt, do you think that this is a symptom of something that is deeply wrong within Western society and Western culture? That it's merely a symptom? There's something actually far deeper and far darker going on there?
I think absolutely, and that's one. Carl Trueman will tell you a lot more about that. He'll speak more eloquently about it than I will. But that's one thing that I noticed in these interviews is that so many of the interviews devolved pretty quickly into well, what is truth? A college professor is a infamous example now that I talked to a college professor, turned into this. But really, every single interview I had, especially even with people on the street, eventually turned into this like Pontius Pilate. What is truth? Is there a truth? Whose truth are we talking about? And what that tells me is that the deeper thing going on is relativism. You know, that's people are raised in our society to believe that we all have our own truth. Truth is whatever you say it is. Whatever you feel is true, you know. And I can remember being raised, even when I was a kid, hearing this kind of thing all the time. And so I think that's what's happening underneath all this. Really, it is a war against truth, and it's what lies underneath all of it is relativism. It's the rejection of objective truth entirely.
And how much do you think of this is caused by technology? One of the things that I often think about is we now have the technology to do some of these surgeries in a way that we didn't have before. And obviously we now have technology to propagate the ideology in a way that we didn't have before. And those things coming together seems to me like two very powerful things that, from my perspective, offer perhaps an even better explanatory option than you know, ideologues driving it. Like the ideology was there and then the technology came along to fuel it, or is it more maliciously intended, you know, making money off it or whatever? What's your take?
I think it's all of the above, but it'd be impossible to overstate the effects of technology. Now, you're right that the technology for the actual surgeries has advanced quite a bit, but it's still a barbaric Frankenstein stuff they're doing, and it always will be. I mean, when you're trying to construct false genitalia, doesn't matter how advanced the medicine is, it's always going to be, it's always what you're doing. You're constructing false genitalia, which is always going to be barbaric. But the propagation, I think, is the big thing. And here's what happens. I think kids, they go to school, most kids do, like public schools, and they spend 5 days a week, right, 6, 7 hours a day, 9 months a year for 12 or 13 years, and they're marinating in this peer culture where gender ideology now is just totally taken over. And then that's bad enough, but then they leave school, but they don't leave the peer culture behind because they carry it around with them. They have it in their pocket, they have it on their phone. So it just becomes this kind of like fog that they never escape, this choking fog they can never get away from. And the drive and compulsion when you're a kid to try to fit in is overwhelming, and we all remember it as kids. For a lot of adults, it's still overwhelming, but especially when you're a kid. And that's even more the case when they can never escape their peers. And so, like, you know, they're already driven to be accepted by their peers, but when you're around your peers all the time, even at home, you're still with them. Then if you're not accepted by them, then it becomes a real crisis. That's one of the reasons why the suicide rate among kids, tragically, is so much higher than it ever was. And so I think that's what drives a lot of these ideas. It just catches on. It's like the cool, popular thing now. Not necessarily to be trans is cool and popular, but the main thing for kids is you don't be cis, right? To be anything, pick something else, gender nonconforming, non-binary, Z's or Zem pronouns, whatever it is, furry, like just pick something that isn't plain old ordinary regular, you know? And now that that's caught on, there's just no stopping it, which is why, like, you know, if you have to send your kid to public school, I'd recommend don't do it. But if you have to, you have to. But there's no excuse, I think, to give an adolescent kid a phone with full internet access that they can just use all day up in their room. Who knows what they're looking at? It's just, it's crazy, I think.
Yeah, it is a recipe for disaster. Matt, we've seen, you know, a huge amount of growth with young girls and pubescent girls wanting to transition. Now, there's been a lot of theories being put about. A lot of it, people are saying, you know, they're autistic girls who may feel that way, or they're girls who, for whatever reason, feel desperately uncomfortable in their bodies. What do you think the reason is behind this?
Well, I think, first of all, the drive to be, girls in general are more relational. You know, they have more friends. They care more about, you know, what their friends think, which often could be a very good thing about you know, kind of that feminine tendency. But at the same time, it can also lead to, you know, wanting even more to be accepted by their peers. But I think even deeper than that, a lot of this stuff kicks in around puberty, right? And when you're going through puberty, whether you're a boy or a girl, your body is changing in ways that are confusing. And I think that's especially the case for girls. And the changes that girls go through during puberty are even more drastic and can be more sort of unsettling for the girl. And so I think, especially at puberty, feeling sort of not at home in your own body, feeling like your body is revolting against you and doing things that you don't want. It's normal to feel that way, even more normal for girls, given what they experience. The difference is that when we were all kids, you went through puberty and you had that kind of awkward phase, and it was a phase, and all the adults in your life said, oh, it's just a phase, you'll get over it, you'll be fine. This is, you know, all these changes are good, and you'll grow into yourself and grow into your body and all that kind of stuff. But now, the adults are going around to the kids and telling them, oh, well, if you feel like you're not at home in your body, then it's because you're not. It's because you actually should have a different body. And here's the other great thing they say, to the girls especially, you can just take a pill and all these changes you don't want, you don't have to go through it. You know, puberty is actually something that you have to consent to. Like biology and your body doesn't have a right to do this on its own. You have to consent to it. And you could just, here's a little magical button you can press and stop all this.
And by the way, here's some testosterone you can take that reduces your anxiety, which is very natural in that period. Matt, we could talk to you for a lot longer, but you're a busy guy. We promised to let you go after half an hour. So wrapping up, I'll ask you the question that we always ask all of our guests, and it doesn't have to be related to the movie or anything we've talked about today, which is, what do you think is the one thing we're not talking about as a society that we really should be?
I mean, there's so many things on this particular topic, but I'll say one that's related to it. That's just on my mind because of something that happened last week, and it's just an issue that's always been important to me. I think we need to talk about the pharmaceutical industry in general, and as it relates to mental health. There was this study that just came out last week about antidepressants. Mm-hmm. Revealing that, these antidepressants have been prescribed on a theory of depression that was just a myth. And the pharmaceutical industry has profited billions of dollars giving people these drugs that it would seem aren't doing anything for them really. And that's a whole topic there, when we talk about depression, mental illness, the way that we treat it, the way that we think about it, I think we need to go back and reanalyze a lot of that on a real kind of fundamental level.
Matt, it has been an absolute pleasure. If people want to watch a movie, where can they do that?
Well, you can go to whatiswoman.com or just go to dailywire.com, become a member, subscribe, and watch the movie and tell all your friends about it.
All right. Well, thanks for giving us your time, and thank you for watching and listening. We'll see you very soon with another brilliant episode like this one or Raw Show. All of them go out at 7 p.m. UK time.
And for those of you who like your Triggernometry on the go, it's also available as a podcast. Take care and see you soon, guys.